Welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for the best Reddit creepypasta stories, perfect for bedtime chills. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the story. It started when we moved into the old house on Maple Street. My dad got a new job in another town, so we had to move. The house was a fixer-upper, but it had a lot of charm. It was built in the early 1900s and had these creaky wooden floors and old-fashioned light fixtures. The kind of house that you see in horror movies, but we didn't think much of it at the time. The first few days were uneventful. We were busy unpacking and getting settled in. I found the Ouija board on the third day. We were cleaning out the garage, which was full of old junk from the previous owners. I was digging through a box of books when I saw it. It was at the bottom of the box, covered in dust. The board was made of wood, with the alphabet and numbers carved into it. The planchette was this small, heart-shaped piece of wood, with a little glass window in the middle. I showed it to my sister, Emily, who's a year younger than me. She thought it was cool and wanted to try it out right away. I was curious too, so we took it inside and set it up on the living room floor. Our parents were out getting groceries, so it was just the two of us. We sat cross-legged on the floor with the board between us. I remember feeling a little nervous as we placed our fingers on the planchette. Emily said we needed to say something to start, so she asked, "Is anyone there?" Nothing happened at first. We sat there in silence, staring at the board. I was about to laugh it off when the planchette moved. It was slow at first, but then it started moving faster. Our fingers followed it as it spelled out Hello. Emily and I looked at each other, eyes wide. "Who are you?" she asked. The planchette moved again, spelling out Sarah. "Do you live here?" I asked. Yes. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was starting to feel too real. Emily seemed fascinated though, so she kept asking questions. "How did you die?" she asked. The planchette didn't move for a long time. Just when I thought it was over, it spelled out Murder. We both gasped. I wanted to stop, but Emily was hooked. She kept asking more questions, but the planchette didn't move again. After a while, we gave up and put the board away. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the board and what it had spelled out. I tried to convince myself that it was just a game, that maybe Emily was the one moving the planchette. But deep down, I felt like something was wrong. A few nights later, strange things started happening. It began with small things. Objects would move on their own, lights would flicker, and we'd hear footsteps when no one else was home. My parents thought it was just the house settling, but I knew better. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like it was coming from far away. I got out of bed and followed the sound to the garage. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a dim light coming from inside. My heart was pounding as I pushed the door open. The Ouija board was lying on the floor, the planchette moving on its own. It was spelling out something over and over again. I leaned in to see what it was saying. It spelled out Getout. I backed away, terrified. I ran back to my room and hid under the covers, shaking. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told Emily what happened. She didn't believe me at first, but then she saw the board for herself. The planchette was still moving, slowly now, but it kept spelling out the same thing. Getout. We told our parents, but they didn't believe us. They thought we were just trying to scare them. But things kept getting worse. The whispering grew louder. Objects would fly across the room, and we'd wake up with scratches on our arms and legs. It was like something was trying to hurt us. One night, Emily and I decided to use the board again. We needed to find out what was happening. We sat down in the living room and placed our fingers on the planchette. "Who are you?" I asked. The planchette moved slowly, spelling out Sarah. "What do you want?" Emily asked. The planchette moved faster now, almost angrily. It spelled out Death. We were both terrified. I wanted to stop, but Emily kept asking questions. "Whose death?" she asked. The planchette spelled out YOURS. We both screamed and threw the board across the room. It hit the wall and fell to the floor, but the planchette kept moving. It spelled out YOURS over and over again. We ran to our parents' room and told them everything. They finally believed us when they saw the scratches on our arms and legs. We all decided to leave the house that night and stay at a hotel. But as we were packing, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, almost like it was right next to us. We heard footsteps coming from the garage, followed by a loud crash. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and went to check it out. He came back pale and shaking. "We need to leave, now," he said. We didn't ask any questions. We grabbed what we could and left the house. We drove to a hotel and stayed there for the night. The next morning, we called a priest to bless the house. He said there was a dark presence there and that we needed to get rid of the board. We went back to the house with the priest, and he performed a ritual to cleanse the house. We watched as he burned the Ouija board in the fireplace. As the board burned, we heard a loud scream, like someone was in pain. Then it was silent. The priest told us that the spirit was gone, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. We moved out of the house a few weeks later, and I've never touched a Ouija board since. But sometimes I still hear the whispering, and I can't help but wonder if Sarah is still out there, waiting for her chance to come back. After we moved out of the old house on Maple Street, life seemed to return to normal. We found a new place in a nearby town, and for a while, the eerie experiences felt like a distant nightmare, but the sense of relief was short-lived. A month after moving into our new home, strange things began happening again. It started with the small things, just like before. Doors that were left open would be found closed, lights would flicker, and the temperature would drop suddenly, sending chills down our spines. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of Emily whispering. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:33 a.m. Her voice was faint and muffled, like she was talking to someone. I got out of bed and walked to her room, feeling a sense of dread with each step. When I opened the door, I saw Emily sitting on her bed, her back turned to me. She was holding something in her hands and whispering to it. I took a step closer and saw it was a small wooden box. My heart sank as I realized what it was. The planchette from the Ouija board. "Emily, what are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She turned to face me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "I found it in my suitcase. It was just there," she said, her voice barely audible. I walked over and took the planchette from her hands. It was cold to the touch, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "We need to get rid of this," I said. We went to the backyard and buried the planchette deep in the ground, hoping that would be the end of it. But the next morning, it was back on Emily's bed. The scratches on our arms and legs returned, deeper and more painful than before. We tried everything to get rid of it, burning it, throwing it in the river, even breaking it into pieces, but it always found its way back. Desperate, we called the priest again. He came to our new house and performed another cleansing ritual. He told us that the spirit was attached to the planchette and that we needed to find a way to sever the connection. That night, we all slept in the living room, too scared to be alone. I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. My heart pounded as I saw a dark figure standing at the end of the hall. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. She stared at me with a look of pure hatred. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I just stood there, frozen in fear. The woman slowly walked towards me, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped and whispered, "Leave, or I'll take them." Suddenly, the lights flickered and she was gone. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. My parents and Emily woke up and ran to my side. I told them what I saw, and we knew we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We moved in with my grandparents for a while, hoping that the spirit wouldn't follow us there. But the haunting continued. The planchette appeared under my pillow one night, and the whispers grew louder and more menacing. We were living in constant fear, not knowing when or where the spirit would strike next. My grandparents, who were skeptical at first, began to believe us after they experienced the strange occurrences themselves. My grandmother found deep scratches on her arms one morning, and my grandfather heard the whispers late at night. We were all on edge, afraid to be alone and afraid to sleep. One evening, my grandmother suggested we seek help from a medium. Desperate and with no other options, we agreed. The medium, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, came to our house the next day. She was a small, frail woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. She walked through the house, her face growing more serious with each step. She stopped in the living room and turned to us. "There is a strong, malevolent presence here," she said. "It's attached to the planchette and won't leave until it gets what it wants." "What does it want?" my mother asked, her voice shaking. Mrs. Hawthorne looked at Emily and me. "It wants you two. It's angry and vengeful. It wants to take you away." We all sat in stunned silence. The thought of the spirit taking Emily or me was terrifying. Mrs. Hawthorne suggested a more powerful cleansing ritual, one that would sever the spirit's connection to the planchette and hopefully banish it for good. We gathered in the living room that night, the planchette placed on the coffee table. Mrs. Hawthorne lit candles and burned sage, chanting in a language I didn't understand. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped. As she chanted, the planchette began to move on its own. It spelled out N-O. Mrs. Hawthorne's chanting grew louder and more intense. The planchette moved faster, spelling out L-E-A-V-E. Suddenly the candles blew out, and we were plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. I felt a hand grip my shoulder, cold and strong. I screamed, but no sound came out. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice cut through the chaos. "Begone, spirit! You have no power here." The grip on my shoulder tightened, and I felt a searing pain. The planchette flew off the table and shattered against the wall. The whispers stopped, and the room was silent. The candles flickered back to life, and we saw Mrs. Hawthorne standing over the broken planchette, her face pale and exhausted. "It's over," she said, her voice weak. "The spirit is gone." We all let out a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in months, we felt safe. We thanked Mrs. Hawthorne and paid her for her services. She warned us to never use a Ouija board again, and to be careful of objects that might have a dark history. We moved back to our new house, hoping to finally put the ordeal behind us. For a while, things were normal. The strange occurrences stopped, and we started to feel like a normal family again. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. I had a sense of dread that the spirit might still be out there, waiting for another chance to return. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. For a few months, life finally seemed to settle back into a sense of normalcy. We had started to put the haunting behind us, and the memory of those terrifying nights began to fade. However, just as we were starting to feel safe, the unthinkable happened. It was a cold, rainy night when I first noticed something was wrong again. I had just finished my homework and was getting ready for bed when I heard a familiar sound. The whispering. It was faint at first, almost like a distant hum, but it grew louder as the night went on. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind or my imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. The next morning, I woke up with a deep sense of dread. I had almost convinced myself it was just a bad dream when Emily burst into my room, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "It's back," she whispered, holding up the planchette. My heart sank. It was the same one we had buried and tried to destroy countless times. We ran to our parents, who were just as terrified as we were. We decided to call Mrs. Hawthorne again, but when we tried to reach her, we found out she had passed away just a week after she performed the cleansing ritual. We were on our own. That night, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just in my head. They filled the entire house. My parents heard them too, and we all huddled together in the living room, too scared to be alone. The temperature dropped, and we could see our breath in the cold air. The lights flickered, and shadows danced on the walls. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, and a gust of freezing wind blew through the house. The planchette flew out of Emily's hands and landed on the coffee table. It moved on its own, spelling out ITSNOTOVER. We watched in horror as the planchette continued to move, faster and more erratic. It spelled out DEATHCOMES. We tried to run, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut, and the whispers grew louder, filling our heads with a cacophony of voices. My dad grabbed a baseball bat and swung it at the planchette, but it went right through, hitting the table instead. The planchette stopped moving, and the whispers suddenly ceased. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the hallway. We turned to see the dark figure of the woman, Sarah, standing there. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth was twisted into a malicious grin. She stepped forward, and the room grew colder. We could feel her anger, her hatred, as she moved closer. My mum screamed, and we all backed away, huddling together in the corner of the room. "Leave us alone!" my dad shouted, swinging the bat at her, but it went right through her, hitting the wall behind. She laughed, a horrible, chilling sound that echoed through the house. "You took my life?" she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Now I will take yours." She lunged at us, and everything went dark. I felt a searing pain in my chest and heard my family's screams. When I opened my eyes, we were all lying on the floor, the room eerily silent. The planchette was gone, and so was Sarah. We spent the next few days in a state of shock, trying to come to terms with what had happened. We knew we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed up our things and moved in with my aunt, hoping that distance would keep us safe. But the haunting followed us. The planchette appeared in our new home, and the whispers began again. We were living in a constant state of fear, not knowing when the spirit would strike next. One night, I woke up to find Emily standing at the foot of my bed. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and she was holding the planchette. "It's time," she whispered, her voice not her own. I tried to reach for her, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Emily's face twisted into a malicious grin, and she placed the planchette on my chest. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing my skin. "We have to finish what we started," she said, her voice now a distorted, echoing whisper. The planchette began to move on its own, spelling out words that burned into my mind. YOUAREMINE. I could feel Sarah's presence, her anger and hatred seeping into my very soul. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room grew colder, and the whispers filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. Suddenly, the planchette flew off my chest and shattered against the wall. The whispers stopped, and Emily collapsed to the floor. I could move again, and I rushed to her side, shaking her awake. She was pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to end this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We have to find a way to stop her." We knew we couldn't do it alone. We needed help, but we didn't know who to turn to. Mrs. Hawthorne was gone, and the priest we called refused to come after hearing our story. We were running out of options, and time was running out. In a desperate attempt, we turned to the internet. We found a forum for paranormal experiences and posted our story, hoping someone would believe us and offer help. Most people dismissed it as a hoax, but one user, a self-proclaimed demonologist named Lucas, reached out to us. He told us that Sarah was a vengeful spirit, bound to the planchette by a powerful curse. The only way to sever the connection was to perform a ritual to trap her spirit and destroy the planchette for good. It was dangerous, but it was our only hope. We gathered the necessary items for the ritual, a circle of salt, candles, and a mirror. Lucas guided us through the steps via video call, his voice steady and reassuring. We placed the planchette in the center of the circle and lit the candles. As we chanted the incantation, the planchette began to move, spelling out "Eno." The air grew thick and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. The planchette moved faster, spelling out YOUWILLDIE. Suddenly the candles blew out and we were plunged into darkness. The room grew colder, and we could see our breath in the air. The mirror cracked and a dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sarah, her eyes burning with rage. "You cannot stop me," she hissed, her voice echoing through the room. We continued the ritual, our voices trembling but determined. The planchette shook violently, and the salt circle began to glow. Sarah screamed, a blood-curdling sound that made my skin crawl. "Begone, spirit!" Lucas shouted through the call. "You have no power here." The planchette shattered, and Sarah let out one final ear-piercing scream before vanishing into the darkness. The room fell silent, and the temperature returned to normal. We looked at each other, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," Lucas said, his voice filled with relief. "The spirit is gone." We thanked him profusely and ended the call. For the first time in months, we felt a sense of peace. The planchette was gone, and the whispers had ceased. We finally felt safe. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Sarah's hatred and anger were so intense. It felt like she could come back at any moment. We decided to stay vigilant and never let our guard down. As the days turned into weeks, the fear slowly began to fade. We started to rebuild our lives, but the memory of those terrifying nights still haunted us. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Despite Lucas's assurance that the spirit was gone, a lingering sense of dread clung to our family. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and the fear that Sarah might return never truly left us. We tried to move on, but the events of the past months had left deep scars. One evening, a few weeks after the ritual, I was in my room scrolling through the Paranormal forum where we first found Lucas. I wanted to see if anyone else had experienced something similar, or if there were any new insights about spirits like Sarah. As I read through the posts, a private message notification popped up. It was from Lucas. "Hey, I've been thinking about your case," the message began. "I believe there's more to Sarah's story. Spirits like her often have unfinished business. You need to find out what happened to her and why she's so vengeful. Only then can you truly be free." My heart sank. The thought of diving back into that nightmare was terrifying, but if it was the only way to ensure our safety, we had no choice. I called a family meeting and shared Lucas's message with everyone. My parents were hesitant at first, but Emily was determined. "We need to do this," she said, her voice steady. "We can't live in fear forever." We decided to start by researching the history of our old house on Maple Street. A trip to the local library and a few hours of digging through old records revealed a disturbing story. In the early 1900s, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell lived in the house. She was engaged to a man named Thomas, but he mysteriously disappeared a week before their wedding. Devastated, Sarah became reclusive and was later found dead in the house under suspicious circumstances. The official cause of death was suicide, but rumours of foul play persisted. We knew we needed more information, so we tracked down a local historian who specialised in unsolved mysteries. Mr. Jenkins was an elderly man with a vast knowledge of the town's history. When we told him about Sarah, he nodded knowingly. "Ah yes, Sarah Mitchell. Her story is a tragic one," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Many believe she was murdered by Thomas, who fled town to avoid scandal. Her spirit has been restless ever since." "Do you know where we can find more about her?" Emily asked. "There's an old journal," Mr. Jenkins replied. "Sarah's diary. It was never made public, but I believe it's still in the house. It might hold the key to understanding her." The thought of returning to that house filled me with dread, but we had to do it. We gathered our courage and drove to Maple Street. The house was still empty, its windows dark and foreboding. We broke in through a back window, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside was cold and stale, and the memories of our time there came rushing back. We made our way to the attic, where Mr. Jenkins said the diary was likely hidden. After what felt like hours of searching, Emily found a small, dusty box hidden under the floorboards. Inside was Sarah's diary, its pages yellowed with age. We took the diary back to our new house and began to read. Sarah's entries were filled with love for Thomas, but as we read on, the tone shifted. She wrote about his strange behaviour, the arguments, and her suspicions that he was hiding something. The final entries were the most disturbing. Sarah described a night when Thomas came home covered in blood, his eyes wild with fear. He confessed to killing someone, and Sarah realised she was in danger. The last entry was a single sentence. "If I disappear, it was Thomas." We sat in stunned silence, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. She hadn't taken her own life. She was murdered by the man she loved. Her spirit had been seeking justice for over a century. We knew what we had to do. We needed to perform another ritual, this time to help Sarah find peace. Lucas guided us through the steps over a video call. We gathered in our living room, placing the diary and a photo of Sarah in the centre of a salt circle. As we chanted the incantation, the temperature dropped and the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't menacing. They sounded sad, almost pleading. The diary began to glow, and we felt a presence in the room. "Sarah, we know what happened to you," Emily said, her voice shaking. "Thomas hurt you, and you deserve justice. We're here to help you find peace." The whispers grew louder, but they weren't angry. It felt like Sarah was trying to communicate. The pages of the diary began to turn on their own, stopping on a page with a drawing of a locket. We realised it was the locket Thomas had given Sarah, a symbol of their love and betrayal. "We need to find the locket," Lucas said. "It's the key to freeing her spirit." We searched the diary for clues about the locket's location. In one of the entries, Sarah mentioned hiding it in a secret compartment in her room. We drove back to the old house, our nerves on edge, and searched her room. After hours of looking, we found a small hidden drawer in the wall, and inside was the locket. As soon as we touched it, the air around us grew cold, and we heard Sarah's voice, clear and desperate. "Free me," she whispered. We took the locket back to our house and placed it in the centre of the salt circle with the diary. We began the ritual again, this time calling on Sarah's spirit to find peace. "Sarah, we have your locket," I said, my voice steady. "We know the truth. You don't have to suffer anymore." The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a mournful wail. The locket began to glow, and we saw a faint figure appear in the room. It was Sarah, her eyes filled with sadness and longing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The locket shattered, and the room filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, Sarah was gone. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in months, we felt a sense of peace. Lucas's voice came through the call, filled with relief. "It's done. She's free." We thanked Lucas and ended the call, feeling a weight lifted from our shoulders. The haunting was finally over. We knew Sarah had found peace, and we could finally move on with our lives. But even as we celebrated, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much we didn't understand. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Months passed, and life began to return to normal. The terrifying experiences that had plagued our family seemed like a distant memory, and we slowly rebuilt our sense of security. The haunting had ceased, and for the first time in a long time, we felt at peace. But as much as we wanted to believe it was over, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. One evening, as we gathered for dinner, my father brought up a topic we had all been avoiding. "We need to talk about what happened," he said, his voice steady but serious. "I think it's important that we understand everything. We need closure." We all nodded in agreement. It was time to face the past head on. We decided to revisit the diary one last time, hoping it would provide any final clues or answers. As we flipped through the pages, we found something we had missed before. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the back cover. It was a letter addressed to Sarah, written by Thomas. The letter was chilling. It detailed Thomas's growing paranoia and guilt over the murder he had committed. He confessed his love for Sarah, but also admitted that he had been hearing voices, whispers, telling him to do unspeakable things. He feared for his sanity and warned Sarah to stay away from him. The final lines sent shivers down my spine. "I'm sorry for what I've done. The voices won't leave me. They say they will come for you too. If I disappear, know that it wasn't by choice. Forgive me, Sarah. I love you." The realization hit us like a ton of bricks. The whispers, the haunting, they weren't just Sarah's doing. Something darker and more malevolent was at play. Something that had influenced Thomas and ultimately led to his and Sarah's tragic end. We contacted Lucas again, sharing our new discovery. He was concerned, but not entirely surprised. "It sounds like you're dealing with a much older and more powerful entity," he said. "One that preys on vulnerable minds, driving them to madness and despair. This spirit is ancient, and its connection to the planchette was just a means to an end." Lucas advised us to perform one final ritual, this time to banish the malevolent entity for good. We needed a powerful protective circle, stronger than anything we had done before. He guided us through the preparations, which included gathering rare herbs, sacred symbols, and a blessed relic. The night of the ritual, we gathered in our living room, forming a tight circle around the protective symbols. The air was heavy with anticipation and fear. We began the chant, calling upon protective spirits and invoking the power of light to banish the darkness. As we chanted, the room grew colder and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. The malevolent entity was fighting back, its presence a palpable force of anger and hatred. The candles flickered, and the shadows seemed to grow and move on their own. Suddenly, the protective circle glowed with a bright, intense light, and a violent wind tore through the room. We held our ground, our voices rising above the chaos. The wind howled, and the whispers turned into anguished screams. "Begone, spirit!" Lucas's voice commanded through the speaker. "You have no power here. Return to the darkness from whence you came." The room shook, and the light from the protective circle intensified. I felt a searing pain in my chest, but I didn't stop chanting. I could see my family doing the same, their faces determined and resolute. With one final, ear-piercing scream, the entity was torn from the room, the force of its departure knocking us to the ground. The wind ceased, and the room fell silent. The air was clear, and the oppressive darkness that had filled the house was gone. We lay there for a moment, catching our breath, the realization slowly sinking in. It was over, truly over this time. The malevolent entity had been banished, and its hold on us was broken. We thanked Lucas once more, eternally grateful for his guidance and support. The house felt different now, warmer, lighter, and free from the fear that had haunted us for so long. In the weeks that followed, we experienced no more strange occurrences. The whispers were gone, and the scars of our ordeal began to heal. We were finally able to move forward, knowing that we had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about Sarah and Thomas, their tragic love story and the dark forces that tore them apart. I hope that wherever they are, they found the peace they deserve. And as for the Ouija board, we vowed never to speak of it again. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Some things are better left alone, and some doors should never be opened.